Good afternoon. A little bit loud, sorry. My name is Michael Wallent, and I'm a general manager in the Windows Client division at Microsoft. So far this morning, we've seen the Longhorn experience in the Windows shell and in applications that real developers wrote with real code. So what I'd like to do today in the next hour is talk about a couple things. Talk about, first of all, what Avalon actually is, besides the code name. And what it is it is the presentation platform for Windows Longhorn, for Longhorn and beyond. We're also going to talk about the mission. The mission for Avalon is enabling developers, you, to present the vision of Longhorn in your applications. So the way we'll try to do that is talk a little bit about what the goals were, how we went about it, kind of what the tenets were behind building Avalon. And then also talk about, in detail, what the parts are of Avalon and give you a bit of a roadmap where you can see what the pieces are, what the presentations are, where you can go to the breakout sessions and see the people who wrote the code, designed the code, tested the code, show you how to actually make it work in your own applications. So the approach, the fundamental approach that we took. One of the important things and the meta trends that we saw is that the notion of what user interface was, what documents were, and what media was merging together. Many of the experiences that people have in applications today, be it on the web, be it on the desktop, it's hard to actually say, what is it? Is it a document? Is it an application? Is it some multimedia presentation? What we saw was that going forward, there would be no line from a user experience point of view as to what things were. So it made sense then, from a platform point of view, to make sure that there wasn't a line in the platform creating user interface, creating media, or creating documents. Another important part towards the approach was on the graphics side, making sure that we had a vector-based solution. Really there, it was important for two reasons. One was a quality reason. Displays are becoming higher and higher resolution. And also, we thought that scalability was a critical part. So a vector-based graphics engine, as opposed to a bitmap-based graphics engine, was critical going forward. The other thing was going towards a model where declarative programming could be used across the board. Today, web developers use HTML and JavaScript extensively to build applications. But sometimes people think that doing something declaratively isn't quite as good. We wanted to make sure that declarative programming and procedural programming were first-class citizens both together in providing the solution for developers. So I talked about integration a little bit. We wanted Avalon to be this integrated platform from an experience point of view and also from a developer experience point of view. At the same time, we wanted to deliver world-class platforms in their own right in the user interface space, in the media space, and in the document space. And we'll talk about in more detail what the elements of that are. So let's actually invite Pablo Fernicola, who's the group program manager on the Avalon team, to come up and show us an example of some Avalon applications and how they can be built.
Thank you, Michael. We saw a lot of exciting applications this morning and demonstrations. One of the things we're going to do in this talk is go one level down, look into a little bit more detail at what the functionality that the platform presents is. So the first thing we're going to do is jump right into an application that's more media-centric.
One of those things, it's more interesting to write the code and figure out how to make it work.
Update. On June 9th, at the National Show, the National Cable and Telecommunications.
So one of the things that we can see through this is I'm going through and clicking on different buttons and going through different media experiences. This is something that would fit right in, for example, with your media center PC. And this is probably an application that what you've seen so far is something that you could build with today's technology. One thing to point out is the code for this application is actually in the SDK that you received, so you can go through it and judge for yourselves how easy it is to do. Beyond that, one of the things that you saw this morning is a higher level of refinement, a higher level of quality in terms of the UI that's presented. So the way that it manifests in this application is we have these little preview windows that appear when I go over the reel. And if you now pay attention to the level of refinement in that, how things are presented, you see the video zooms in and comes to a preview. And then when I click, you actually see a nice correlation between the action I took and the results. And this is something that's fairly important for end users because it gives better usability and it just gives them a better idea of what's going on the platform. So beyond this, let's go ahead and click on the favorites over here. And there were a couple of things that went on as I clicked on the button. Let me go ahead and do it again. There is one aspect which is the animation of the panel that's on the bottom that's showing up. But also more important, if you look at the video and the buttons on top, the panel that contains those things gets sized automatically. So it's something that's fairly easy to do if I want to create this kind of experiences. And beyond that, we have these buttons on the bottom. I can click on this and use them to control what experience is on top. Another aspect of having this integrated platform is that if I click on this one here, we actually get a dialog that's popped on top of the video. And since it's all going through the same pipeline, we can overlay, we can blend, and we can hover accelerate both the video, the graphics, and the text because it's all sharing the same backend. So that was a media-centric application. Now let's look at some document things. So I have this container over here that actually has a rendition of the slides that we went through so far, but expressing XAML, expressing that markup language that we talked about earlier. So we have 6 slides. I'm able to go and go through them as if there were pages. And this is actually using something we call the fixed format. So this will look the same if I take it from machine to machine, or if I change my display resolution, or if I print it. So it's a high fidelity representation of the content. And again, we generated this from PowerPoint, and we just generated the XAML through what we call a printer driver. So if I go ahead and zoom in into this, I'm able to see some of the elements of the platform. So you can see the text, for example, that's being re-rendered through the new graphics stack, and it's fairly high resolution. We can actually zoom in a little bit more. And whenever you see things rendered, so for example, the demo part on top, that is actually a bitmap. So PowerPoint is using a bitmap to represent that, whereas the bullets that were on the bottom are actually text. So all that is being rendered through the 3D pipeline and taking advantage of 3D acceleration, which allows us to do this sub-pixel clear type with very high fidelity and performance. Also, what we can do is just zoom out, and we can see the different slides. So if we scroll all the way to the top, the same kind of effects that we saw for the video, we see them applied to the document space. Or we can go ahead and use this control over here and show multiple pages at the same time. A couple of other interesting things in this. This control is called a page viewer control, and that's actually being displayed in the browser. So right now we're in the browser frame viewing a XAML document that actually contains multiple pages. And more important, we're actually adding this page viewer control to the browser experience. And Michael is going to drill into this a little bit more in a few slides. So let's go for another demo that actually brings everything together. The first demo was sort of media UI. The second one was more documents and UI. Let's go ahead and take a look at another one and actually see all these things coming together into a single application. So here is a mock-up, for example, of the Harvard Business Review. Let's say that they had a Longhorn-based application to actually read the different issues. So we'll go ahead and drill into one of them. One of the things that you notice right away is sort of the smooth presentation. But also another thing that we're doing is we're actually data binding to the data on the background. So we actually see some of the things appear over time. So this is a list box with different items presented inside of them. All of the data in that is data bound to the WinFS system and presented to the user. So let's actually drill into one of the articles. And again, that theme of having a very polished presentation, something that really shows the user what happens when you click and when you take actions. So in this case, what we saw before were fixed documents. What we see in this example are flow documents. So right now we have 22 pages worth of content. You can see it at the bottom. If I go ahead and make this window larger, you actually see that we went to 12 pages because we actually get to display more content. So we have this flow content. You can think of a word processing document or an HTML document. So we have this flow document that actually is getting paginated. So as I click on the little thumbs, I'm able to go up and down by page units. So very nice experience for the user. We can go page up again. But it goes beyond this. So this is flow. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we call adaptive flow, where one of the things that's happening nowadays is there's a trend towards having these 16:9 displays. You see some laptops that are 16:9, and you're beginning to see some LCD panels that are 16:9. One of the things with these 16:9 displays is if you take a regular document and maximize it to the window, you actually cannot read the line. A single line of text becomes too long, and you're not able really to take advantage of that display. Well, with adaptive layout, we are looking at solving that problem. So let me hide the list box, and now the document takes over the whole space. So if we go ahead and scroll, you actually see that we have multiple columns. If I go ahead and reduce the size, you'll see that the document adapts. So it adapts going from 2 columns to going to a single column, and then even it adapts on the spacing and the text sizing to maximize the reading experience. And this is something that as a developer, you get for free. Either you just have your XAML document, and they get displayed and adapt as the display changes, or you can actually put some controls into them and define how many columns you want, what kind of margins you want. So quite a bit of controls over that. Now for a more interesting thing is, as I go through the document, as I go through the page viewer, there are the thumbnails that get generated. And as you can see right now, we're showing the thumbnails with 2 columns. So I can click on the document and go there. But more interesting, let's go ahead and reflow this. So it's a single column. And you can actually see that those previews are live. So it's not that a pre-canned, but actually generated and composited on the fly within the application. Let's actually go ahead and take a look at one more document within here that really illustrates the point of bringing together UI, documents, and media. Let me scroll through the document and go to this page, and we'll go ahead and play a movie. So one of the interesting things in here is the same expression, the same XAML that you use to do documents is the XAML that you use to do your UI, and is the XAML that you use to do your media. So we saw those previews, so let's go ahead and move up a little bit. And then we can see that the preview is live. Again, the reason we're able to do this, just like on the other demo, is that it's all going through the same common stack, and it's using the same level of hardware acceleration. But to make this more interesting, we'll go ahead and zoom in a little bit. It's fairly easy in your Avalon apps to go ahead and add a transform at the top and being able to zoom. So let's go ahead and zoom in so you get to see more detail. So you can see that this is being composited and alpha blended on top of the other content. And if we go and click over here, we actually get to see some of the text at a very high magnification rate and a very high resolution. And the interesting thing is I apply the scale percolates all the way through, and my vector graphics get scaled at full resolution. So that was just a quick glimpse of what we mean by bringing UI, documents, and media. And we'll go through some other demos later on in the presentation.
Thanks, Pablo. We'll have you back in a minute, or a few minutes. It's good. So hopefully one of the things that we've now seen from these demonstrations and the other demonstrations you've seen this morning is that there's a lot of power in the rich client application that the Longhorn platform brings. But one of the things that we've heard from developers loud and clear is that powerful applications that are hard to deploy are worse than useless. So the deployment problem is critical to solve before it's credible to even talk about rich client solutions. So we have many presentations over the next 3 days talking exactly about deploying smart client applications using technology like Click Once that is already in the WIDBE.NET framework and will be expanded even further in Windows Longhorn. But this really gets to a core tenet again of the approach that we took, which is that we wanted to look at the best of the web and at the best of Windows and bring them both together in a seamless fashion, essentially a non-lossy fashion. We saw already one of the best of the web things, flowable layout. Step away from the monitor. We saw flowable layout in these examples just now. We wanted to make sure, as well as flowable layout, that there was progressive download and rendering of applications. We wanted to not just be able to progressively render a page of text, but progressively download applications that previously might take multiple tens of megabytes to bring down, now much smaller. I can get just a fraction of the application before it actually starts to run and the user can interact with it. And again, we wanted to make sure that there was a declarative model for building these applications. We'll drill into that more in a couple slides. On the best of Windows side, we wanted to make sure that there was unrestricted functionality. We wanted to make sure we were really exploiting, more than ever, the power that existed on the PC, using the graphics stack, using memory, using storage, using the whole package in a way that Windows developers have come to know and love. We wanted to make sure as well that there was good integration with the Windows desktop. Hard problems like, do I run it in the browser? Do I run it not inside the browser? Are choices that I make on day one impactful down the road? Wanted to solve those sorts of problems as well. Wanted to have great offline support. These applications could be used by someone on a plane, someone disconnected, someone always not with constant networking support. Wanted to make sure as well that there wasn't a performance penalty. Have great scalability, have great performance. Hopefully we've seen some of that already today. We also wanted to make sure that there was great tool support and language support. One of the bets that we made was building this entire new stack on top of the .NET framework. So we have immediate CLI support, other common language support, and even in the disks that you've been given today, you'll see how Visual Studio can help you build Longhorn applications. Just a little bit more on declarative programming. So we've talked a little bit about XAML, and you may have heard about XAML already. Call our extensible markup language. It's XML. Critical feature of this markup language is that there's a one-to-one correspondence between the .NET classes and the markup, essentially between the object model and the markup. XAML is more than just another way to put bits on the screen. It really is almost a persistence format for .NET classes. You can essentially specify the class with its properties, with its state, what its parent relationship is, and that will then render. Because there's this correspondence, we can have the objects be peers, and I'll get into that more in a second. But we think that this markup language is critical to get better interoperability between designers, tools, and the developers who write the code behind the applications. So back to XAML for a second. So XAML, as a markup, as an XML format, can contain code, can contain references to code. It can also be loaded like a resource format by code just through procedural execution. This markup, this XAML markup, can be compiled for execution in a couple of different ways. I can convert it into what we call BAML, or this binary markup language, which is essentially a pre-processed form, or it can be compiled directly into IL. After all, it's just a persistence format for classes. This gives us the guarantee that the procedural code and the markup code are peers in terms of execution speed. We also think it's critical from a process dynamic point of view. The role of designers in the software development process is becoming more and more important. In fact, before I came down here, I was in the grocery store a couple days ago back in Seattle, and the front cover of Time magazine this week it says something either like, the return of design or design counts or something to that effect, where there's a set of well-designed products, hardware products, on the cover of the magazine, and how those are the products that people want to buy. We think that that essence of design will apply more and more, not just to hardware, but to software as well. You've seen the focus this morning with Hillel gave the demo and Pablo giving the demo, talking about the focus on fit and finish and polish. Well, the fact is that the developers are not necessarily the people who develop and build that last level of polish. It's the graphic designers and their role in the process. Those are the people who do that work. Today, those folks use graphic designer tools, but they generate bitmaps. They generate storyboards. They may generate some sort of animation that has nothing to do with the final code. What if designers could work with the markup, either with tools or just directly with editors, to create the experience that they want, hand that off to the developer, let the developer write maybe the event handlers behind it, write the procedural code behind it, and create the experience without having to go back and forth between the designer and the developer. In fact, many of the pieces of the Windows shell itself and the applications that we built were built in just that fashion by folks on staff who were designers, and the developers wrote the code behind it. I mentioned already consistency, making sure that code and markup were first-class citizens. We've heard the concerns with platforms where they're markup-driven, be it HTML, where there's a perceived or a real performance problem. Really critical when you really get into the guts of how it works, and I'm sure Chris Anderson in the client track room would be a great person to corner on this point because he did a lot of the design on that. Code and markup are first-class citizens in the way that they're handled by the system. You can't tell when it's running, whether it came from code or came from markup. Besides that, I talked earlier about the importance of an integrated user experience, but we wanted to have an integrated developer experience for user interface documents and media. Before, when Pablo showed having that document have a video inside of it, if that wasn't a video but it was a graphic, a vector graphic, a rich vector graphic, you'd develop it the same way. You'd program to it the same way. It would catch events the same way. If it was an image, a JPEG, or a TIFF, you'd program to it the same way. You'd put it in the same way. It wouldn't matter. It has to be consistent. And one good benefit of building this entire new stack on the .NET framework is having consistent managed interfaces up and down the stack. Now, I mentioned a little bit about the new stack that we built. We've invested in building an entirely new graphics stack, a peer to the existing graphics stack, all the way from the GDI level all the way up, fully up through the system. We have a new underlying graphics layer where you can program to much like you would program to GDI. We have a new layer for controls, much like you'd program to user. Then we go up a step further with window management. We have new windows, new dialogues, etc. We have new application model services that didn't even exist before. And then better ways than ever to integrate with the shell and with the user experience. This entire stack can be accessed at any level using managed code interfaces. And we'll see as we talk a little bit more about controls, it provides what we believe is a good degree of extensibility so you can decide where to plug in and where to add value. We think fundamentally that this approach of building a stack that's exposed anywhere along the line lets developers like you stand on our shoulders and not on our toes when you build your applications. So, I've talked a little bit about the approach. Let me talk about some of the components that make up Avalon. Now, for these slides, what you're going to see at the bottom, you may have noticed already, is some cross-references to other presentations. What we've tried to do is just give you a little guidepost as to what presentations you could go to in addition to this one that gives you real drill downs, real code, access to the people who wrote it, designed it, built it, who live it every day. And we'll also be in the track room as well for much of the time. Controls. Any presentation platform in many ways starts and ends with controls. It's the heart of what we do as developers, is build up components and applications out of controls. A couple critical things here that we think are different about this platform. One is what we call composition. So let's take a look at this button. It's actually a pretty interesting example. You can imagine in a class hierarchy that you could have done this in a number of different ways. I could have had a class for button, and then I could have subclassed it for a class of button that maybe had some text in it and an image, and it was justified to the sides. And then maybe I created another subclass of that where it didn't just have a flat color background, but maybe it had a gradient background, and then another class subclassed off of that that actually had an image in it instead. Well, we chose not to do it that way. Too many subclasses. What we have here is composition in play. That button is composed up of a piece of text and an image in the foreground objects that we see. But even more interesting, the background brush, which controls essentially how the background is painted, the property itself is composed of at least 3 other elements. There's a radial gradient that we see in the center. There's a gradient up at the top to create what's called the gel button effect. And then there's actually an alpha blended image that we see off to the left. That's the background. Good part there is that those objects, because they're part of the brush, don't interfere with the object model of the button. I'm not going to be getting events on those. So it makes it very, very easy to create very complex objects and to reuse them in your application without creating a ton of subclasses that could potentially get you into trouble. So beyond controls and beyond the look, we also wanted to really extend in the space of layout. So the object that you'll see in the hierarchy is the panel. Panels are the essence of layout. We have a whole set of layouts that you can reuse and build into your applications. We have layouts that do absolute positioning. It's kind of a non-starter. You always have to do that one. We also have a whole set of layouts that do things like flow, not just for documents, but for UI. Let's face it, flow is a great thing in documents, but it's also a great thing in UI, especially as I have to localize and potentially have flexible user interface for different resolutions or different screen sizes. We have flow that does vertical flow, horizontal flow, other things that do docking, where I can dock panels to the left, to the top, and get some additional floating space in the middle. Or you can build your own layouts, your own panels that do things like a hierarchical layout of controls, an organizational chart view. Well, you can do that as a layout. You can do that as a panel. Also, as you can imagine, all of the different parts of this are exposed with properties. And these properties, as I mentioned before, can be composited. But those properties can be grouped together into a style object that can set a whole set of properties at once, even a complex set of properties like an animation or a timing. I can then reuse that on multiple objects on the page, or even use them in multiple applications, common styles. One of the reasons why we wanted to go with an approach that didn't require a lot of subclassing and overriding is that more and more of the platform functionality gets baked in and is actually pretty hard to do. Let's think about accessibility for a second. Accessibility is something we believe is very important and that more and more users and corporations are demanding in their applications for legal reasons, for other reasons, for business reasons. You know, getting the semantic of click right in a button is hard. Seems easy, but it's actually really hard. You have all the mouse events, you've got the right keyboard events, lots of different keyboard events, whether it be enter, whether it be spacebar. It's a lot of work, and we've all probably written that code many, many times. But having that baked into the system where you can use it and you can depend on that as a pattern that can be replicated in your own applications is critical. And you can make sure that you can't just break it by accidentally overriding the wrong method. So fundamentally, it's all about composition. Composition inside the object and composition in the properties. This is the one big takeaway here. And Rob Relier, one of the program managers who really led the design here, will be giving this presentation in CLI 301. We really encourage you to go to that to get more information in this area. In media, that example that Pablo showed previously with the .NET show where the video was sizing and resizing automatically, and we were compositing and alpha-ing graphics, vector graphics on top of the video, and doing it at the natural frame rate of the monitor and not dropping a frame. Lots of things at play there. And in order to make that work, we had to invest and build and essentially replumbing the entire media stack from the bottom up. There's work in the kernel, there's work in DX, there's work in a thing called Media Foundation to deliver that level of glitch-free audio and video. The other thing that's important there is what we call future-proofing, where what we see going forward, not just those 16:9 monitors, but the emergence of high DPI, the emergence of extended color spaces, not just sRGB, but sCRGB, to get even better color density on the displays and in the printed page. So we wanted to make sure that the system was designed with that in mind. You'll notice that the pixels are virtual pixels. They're not really pixels. They act like 96 DPI pixels, and they always work the right way. If you run on a 200 DPI system, the pixels get stretched the right way. I think it's better to probably specify in inches or millimeters or another unit specifying distance, but it's future-proofed. It's very hard to get yourself in trouble there. Another point in the media pipeline has to do with what we call desktop composition. This morning, In the glass demonstration, you saw desktop composition at work. The glass effect you saw on the desktop was enabled by desktop composition. How did it work? Well, the applications, as opposed to rendering directly to the display, rendered to a back buffer. That back buffer was then manipulated with pixel shaders and other effects to create that glass border effect. Looks kind of cool, kind of interesting. We think it'll be visually attractive. But the desktop compositor has a couple other benefits as well. That same composition technology is used to do the composition that we saw earlier in that video application with the graphics over the video. But it's also used to support high DPI applications and high DPI systems. If you think about a high DPI system, and if you go into the hands-on room, you can see one. This big IBM 200 DPI monitor running with 2 graphics cards, there's 2 plugs in the back. If you fire up a classic application that was not high DPI aware, it's like this big. And the little buttons are smaller than you can make your fingers. Really hard to click on. Most apps weren't written being knowledgeable about high DPI. Desktop composition can be used to actually stretch out those applications automatically to make them think that they're really 96 DPI when they're really running more. So we think with that sort of future-proofing, people can buy these high DPI systems. New applications can certainly advantage all the pixels. Old applications will still work and look pretty good. Desktop composition is also really important around accessibility. One of the features that people using accessibility features would like to have is reliable screen magnification. With desktop composition, we can build reliable screen magnification to see any bits on the screen as they get rendered. Fundamentally, this is all based on reliable technology, Direct 3D. Everything goes through the Direct 3D pipeline. Very much unlike today, where the only experience in the Windows desktop that's hardware accelerated is text. Now, everything that goes on in the Windows desktop is hardware accelerated all the time. I think that's a reasonable breakthrough. Data. Talked about data a little bit before. Pablo talked about data, and we saw data binding in that application in kind of a non-traditional way. We've all used data-bound controls or data-bound tables in HTML. The grid is the canonical example. Data binding in most presentation packages is limited to a set of controls, the list box, the grid, etc. And some of those grids are amazingly powerful, do amazing things. But what we've done with data binding, and what you can hear a lot more from Namita Gupta and Alex Hopman in these presentations, is using presentation, using templates, using repeaters outside of a single control, being able to repeat and present over any control, any property in the entire system, while hooking it up to back-end business objects sourced by WinFS, sourced by Indigo, or other XML sources, but backed by a system that can be intrinsically two-way. This transform system isn't like XSLT, where the transform is lossy. Once I've transformed it, very hard to go back. This transform system understands whether it's a one-way transform, a one-time transform, or a two-way transform, where I can bring the data back and forth with great backing business logic. Essentially, it brings data binding out of the grid and into the entire system. Pablo showed you some examples of the document platform. There's a time and a place for fixed documents and for flow documents. You can imagine in a fixed document, if you want something to look exactly the way you want it to look, be it a presentation, be it a marketing document, be it a legal document, you don't want it to change. It looks the way it looks, and it was carefully designed pixel for pixel. We want to have a fixed format that supports that, and we demonstrated how that worked. But there's other times where we want the document to primarily be readable and to use the screen real estate. In those cases, we want the document to flow. We want it to flow across multiple pages, maybe multiple columns up. But then we get into challenges, because now I want to be able to author my page or my document so that no matter what the resolution, no matter what the size is, no matter what the window size is, I still want maximum readability. In that regard, that's where we get into a feature we call adaptive flow. The role of adaptive flow is to look at the system overall, to kind of look at the document, look at the state of the system, and then to set the properties of the document. How many columns, what the font size is, how much space there is between the words, to the optimum settings to increase readability to its maximum. It's backed by a lot of research that figures out how long of a line your eye can look at before your reading speed decreases. So basically, adaptive layout is like your own little research guy in the box who's making your document be as readable as it can be, if that's the thing you're looking for. Pablo showed the document-specific controls integrated in with the browser, what we call the page viewer control, where it understands how to toggle the zoom, how to toggle how many pages go up, how to do the thumbnailing effect on the side, which is kind of interesting, how to do the right page count, but also how to do things like rights management. So we can have these documents be packaged up in a container which knows how to be cryptographically rights managed. So I can guarantee that it only gets to the people who I want it to get to. And notice the presentation at the bottom. Talks about that. So fundamentally, the way that users experience these applications, though, is through the shell, through the desktop experience. And one of the goals for the shell in Windows Longhorn is blurring the distinction between what's an application and what's kind of just there. We don't want it to be this big breaking point where there's hard lines between it. One of the most important ways that you can make sure that your applications are integrated nicely into the user's experience is to expose your data using the common schemas that are exposed, as well as extending the schemas to make sure that the data that's important to you is exposed, and then building the right extensions into the shell to make sure that the shell can display that data, or that you can display that data plugged into the shell in the right way. There's a set of controls like Explorer View and the basket control, which you can reuse in your applications to get that experience plugged in no matter where your app is running or how it's running. We saw the sidebar this morning, another good place to put stuff. You can put sidebar tiles there as appropriate. There's some interesting opportunities to make sure that for the always-on experience, and the experience where you want something to be in people's faces, where it's what they interact with on a day-in, day-out basis, sidebar is a great place to do it. And then while you're there, think about common notifications. Making sure that there's one way that notifications pop up and one way for users to interact with them in a reliable sort of fashion. But fundamentally, the best way to be integrated with the desktop Aero experience is to build on top of the new presentation platform. The new presentation platform, the windows, the buttons, the dialogues, the graphics, they all by default have the Aero look and feel. You get that for free when you use that in your applications. And you can see a set of presentations there. There's also some interesting presentations in that space about how to build well-designed user experiences, which I don't think is on this list, but that's an interesting one to check out. So with that, I'm going to ask Pablo to come back up and demonstrate some more detailed demos and actually do some code showing how to build some more Avalon stuff.
Thanks, Michael. So the first one is actually an ideal application to show off the control topics that Michael was talking about. Similar to the other application, this is in the SDK, so you're able to build and play with this code. So what we see right now is something that looks very much like a Win32 application, a few buttons, a few icons. But what we're going to use this application for is actually to present different experiences depending on which user is active. You can think of this also as something that you would use if you have one application that has two versions, an entry level and a high level, and you want to hide some functionality, you want to have it look different. You'll be able to leverage this as well for that. So the first thing I'm going to do is, if you notice, for example, there's 3 buttons on the bottom over here for this particular user. I'm going to go ahead and change to another user. So for this particular user, we decided to hide the buttons on the bottom that were not applicable to him. As well as change, for example, the way that the input box, the text input box looks like, the way that the button looks like. Let me switch back to the first one. The important thing is, in going from one experience to the other one, we're using the fundamentals that Michael was talking about in terms of separating the code and the visual. So we actually had our designer go through and make these changes. Our developer did not have to change the code. The code to handle how the button, what happens when the button is clicked, or what happens to the list box as you select different icons, all that code is the same. The code doesn't change. It's just the designer changing the way that things look through styling. So you're able to do things that are very hard or really impossible to do today in Win32, where the button takes on a whole new look and it animates differently when I click, as well as just taking the images and rotate them in different ways. Another example is, let's go to this user, and highlighting something that we saw this morning, as well as something that we saw on the previous demo, is we're going ahead and taking the different elements of having a video, having images, having text, having vector graphics, and all piped through the same stack, just rendering. And let's go to this one over here, which is more, if you want to think of it as an Xbox kind of thing. But again, allowing the designer to go directly into the application and really express the whole power of the design, of the vision they have, without being limited by what the developer can or cannot do. It's totally handled through styling. A couple of other interesting things, just like on the document demo that I did earlier. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in so we get to see how this looks a little bit. So all of the graphics that we see, the little shadows and the little bevels, all that built with vector graphics, as well as the text, going through the same code. And some of the styling is actually reused. So if you look at the buttons on the bottom, as well as the button over here, they all share this graphical resource that's just being reutilized and repurposed. So we can actually zoom over here on the button as well. Nice thing about being a vector graphics is, the little animation highlight is just changing a property on the background of the button, and you don't have to have 2 or 3 different bitmaps to achieve that. So let's go to the next sample, which is actually one that I really feel very, very excited about, which is by a third-party company. It's called Infragistics, and they actually have a booth on the floor. So there are a couple of things that are important about this. One of them is it wasn't written by us. It was written by somebody else. They wrote it in about 3 weeks. So they started from zero. They had no Longhorn knowledge. And in about 3 weeks, they built this. This demo pretty much is just one of their controls, just highlighting the control composition part, highlighting the data binding. So in this case, they have a business object that represents all of the information about different albums. And then they project that information in a way that's very different than what you would have today. Today you would have a grid with some text or some tables. In this case, it's actually list items. They're actually creating controls. They're creating controls based on the data that we have. So let me go ahead and sort this, for example, by genre. So we go ahead and click. And again, you notice that they started to apply that polish on the UI that lets me know what happens when I click on things. Let me know what's the intent. So now we went ahead and grouped this through the different genre. We can go ahead and expand some of the songs and look at information. Let's go ahead and expand jazz. So we can go ahead and take a look at all this data. There's something like 200 items here, so it's fairly hard to go through it. So one of the things I'm going to do is actually group by artist. So I click over here, and I have this nice hierarchy on top that lets me know what are we pivoting, what the pivot is for the different things. So now I get to see all the different artists and what they have. So we'll go ahead and drill into Ella Fitzgerald over here at the bottom. And we get to see all of the songs and all of the information related to that in a simple presentation. Now, one of the things I can do, for example, let's say I want to burn a CD or something like that. I can go ahead and click on duration and actually sort by the different duration. Now, this is a nice use of the client, a nice integration between the client and the server. So I may have some server or some local data source, for example, WinFS, that contains all this data, and then my client application, the end user is able to have a rich interaction with the client application. So in this case, I sorted, decreasing and increasing in terms of duration. Let's go ahead and resort it increasing. One of the other things I can do is now I hold the control key, and I'm going to go ahead and sort also by the song title. So it's not only duration, but also song title. So you're able to sort of correlate different pieces of information and get new ways of viewing that information. So data binding, something that we think is fairly powerful, and we're enabling that to be done in different ways than today. Let's go ahead and talk about something that we really didn't have a lot of time in this presentation to talk about. Many times during your development process, you end up writing internal tools to help you to create your application. Or many of you in the audiences, your end product itself is an authoring application. Well, the platform has user interaction services that really make the process of developing these authoring apps fairly easy. So let me go ahead and click over here, bring the text over here. Couple of interesting things. As a resize, you get the automatic ellipses. So not only when you are in user interaction mode, but in any case. So that's very nice for UI, for example, as the window resizes or your dialogues resize. Let's go ahead and take this image, bring it over here. You see the handles and the interaction is all provided for you in the platform. We'll go ahead and move the image over there, and we'll bring this button. And now we have a totally different layout from what we had before. And again, the reason that we can do this is because it's all built on the same underlying platform. So that looks like a decent layout, but being more of a developer, I don't quite like to do that. So let's go ahead and take this and apply a rotation over here. Let's go ahead and take the image and rotate the image as well as the button. Again, all the operations that I'm able to apply to one part of the system, I'm able to apply to all parts of the system in the same way. And since this is a developer conference, we'll go ahead and do a little bit of coding. Basically, you can think of this presentation and the 300 presentation of 301 as being complementary. So in this one here, we really wanted to get a lot of the concepts and not do a lot of coding. But if you go to the 300 and 301, you actually get a lot of coding into that. So this is the code that we had, in this case XAML, that we had to do what we just saw. We had some text, we had an image, we had a button, and really the key things that enabled me to present the user interaction services were these properties on the design surface. One property says I can move the content, another property says that I can resize the content, and the last one says that I can rotate it. That's all I needed to be able to create that simple authoring app. And if I wanted to, the next thing that I would do is just connect it so that I can save that as a XAML file, so that I can then bring it into another application. Maybe I use this tool, and then I bring it into Visual Studio and marry that that XAML file with some code behind file, or maybe that creates the whole experience itself. So let's make this a little bit more interesting, and let's go ahead and change this to be a video element. And we'll change this to be a video. And one of the things I want to do is I want to put a ID on it, so I can do some code behind. We'll add a click handler. And let me see what the name of my click handler is. Play movie. Okay. And we'll add a couple of things so that, for example, my video just doesn't start when it comes up. And also we want this to repeat. So we set it up so that my sorry, I don't want the click handler over here. I already have it on the button. We have an ID for it. We have some things that control the timing of it. And I will go ahead and work on the code behind of it. So one of the things I want to do is I want to hook that button to the video. So if the video is playing, and here is IntelliSense, nice integration between the new platform and VS. And I can say if the media state is playing, we are going to go ahead and make it stop. And we want to make it stop right away. Else will be the case where the video was not playing, and we want to go ahead and start it right away. So that should be it. And like we did before, we can bring the text over here, we can bring the button. So I click once on the button to select it, I'll click again to activate it. And now we have the movie playing. And if the code worked right, if I click on it again, it should stop. And we can bring the movie over here. We can go ahead and rotate it. We can make it play again. And just for kicks, we'll rotate it while it's playing. So there you go. So if you want to see more about how to use these services, CLI 302, which I believe is tomorrow, will drill into quite a bit. And this should help you a lot in either developing your internal tools or if your end application is a tool, Authority tool itself. So that's all for the demos.
Thanks, Pablo. I love the spinning real-time video. It's pretty cool. So far, what we've showed primarily, except for the one picture, was the desktop experience. But there are certainly other form factors as well. And in the past year or so, we've seen the tablet PC, which I think, and I saw many of you actually using in the audience when I was walking around before we started. Now, tablet PC for input, and Pablo talked about the user interface services, has a whole set of new inking capabilities which are built directly into the presentation platform. Other platform services, such as annotation services, built directly in to take advantage of inking or non-inking services directly into the document side of the platform as well, taking advantage of those new form factors and capabilities. Beyond that, also supporting things like the Media Center experience. Having good experiences, be they 10 feet away or 2 feet away. Making sure that I can design and build resolution and size-independent graphics using that vector graphics system. Having great video integration. These are the services that a platform needs to take advantage of these new factors. Now, hopefully, these new services are exciting. But most of you probably have applications already today. And the question is, well, what do I do? How do I go forward? Well, the best way to future-proof your own development is to build today on top of the .NET framework, to write managed code today. And the best way to get started on the road to Longhorn for presentation is writing Windows Forms code. There's lots of presentations during the course of the PDC to talk about doing Windows Forms development and also talk about interoping Windows Forms and Avalon. Windows Forms and Avalon can interop in markup. I can have markup that specifies both Windows Forms controls and Avalon controls. It can be either one on top. There is integration across the board in that space. We also wanted to have great integration with HTML. I can have HTML frames inside of Avalon. I can have an HTML frame or a frame inside of an HTML window that hosts an Avalon object as a doc object. And if you haven't gone down the path of managed code yet, we wanted to make sure that we could have great interop in the Win32 space. We wanted to make sure that your Win32 controls could be hosted. We can do that in one of two ways. We can host HWin-based controls inside of Avalon-based frames and forms. We can host, or we've ensured that Avalon objects can be hosted inside of an existing Win32 form. So it can interop in both of those directions. Fundamentally, one key point to bring out about interop here is that because the new presentation platform is a stack on the side of the existing stack, your existing applications continue to run unaltered. Only when you move over, only when you choose to use the new functionality does it come into play. And I'd point out these talks at the bottom, which are great in this particular interop space. So, a couple things before, make sure I don't forget. We'll be in the client track after the in the client lounge after this presentation. I'd encourage you all to fill out the session evaluations. We'd really like to hear your feedback, and we'll take questions after this slide. So with that, really, to get ready for Longhorn and the new presentation platform, we'd encourage people to start writing managed code today and to write Windows Forms code for their presentation. As you do that, think about how to separate the logic of your application from the visuals to make sure that the presentation aspects can be replaced in the future if you choose to rewrite specifically for Longhorn. And over the next week, I'm sure many Microsoft people and just the conference attendees think about how, and we'd love to hear feedback about how the features we've talked about or new things that you need to make sure that Longhorn is a great platform for opportunity for you going forward in your business. So with that, I'm just going to put up this slide that talks about some session roadmaps. Thank you for your time and invite questions from the audience. Thank you. So there's microphones in the far aisles. We'd like to take questions on those so people can hear, and we'll do that at least for the next 15 minutes or so.
Hi, how much of this functionality, if any of it, will be available in pre-Longhorn OSs, in other words, backported?
So the question is, well, I think people heard the question. This is in the microphone, which, thank you, sir. This new presentation platform fundamentally required us to replumb Windows. This requires a new device driver model, requires new systems from top to bottom. Putting that entire new system on Windows XP or Windows 2000 would basically be moving those particular operating systems up to Windows Longhorn. So we don't expect that a lot of this functionality would go down to down-level systems. This is Longhorn focused. If you are building applications that you want to work on Longhorn and existing systems, we would suggest that you build presentation primarily in Windows forms. Next question.
Yeah, I got a question about like hardware requirements for the new Avalon system. We're talking about a lot more RAM than currently existing current computers, bigger CPUs, that kind of thing.
With respect to hardware requirements, so interestingly, the hardware requirements are mostly on the graphics side. The requirements for the fundamental RAM and CPU speed are not as high up as you would imagine because we're using more of the power of the GPU to get that glitch-free audio, glitch-free video, and glitch-free animation. And if I'm not looking at you, the person who asked the question, I apologize because I can't tell who asked the question. Raise your hand if you asked the question. Okay, there you go. Sorry about that. So we don't expect Avalon itself to cause considerable increase. But in the future, we expect the machines that people have on their desktops to be incredibly powerful. We're trying to build a presentation platform that utilizes that power on the desktop.
When can we expect to see a visual designer for XAML in Visual Studio?
Soon. Next question. Yep, I'll take a question on the left.
Hi there. I'm assuming that you guys are getting away from the idea of having a common user experience because different apps are going to be able to be skinned and themed. I'm also assuming that the desktop itself has been designed with XAML. So are you guys going to open it up to allow the desktop and non-client areas to be skinned like some third-party applications allow right now?
So really two parts to that. One is around common user experience. One of the challenges we face is kind of what the common user experience is. We think there should be some commonality. We're not quite sure about what exactly that is. So I think in some of the design talks, and we'll have to find the right talk, Pablo will find the right talk, and we'll get that to you. They're talking about kind of what makes a good Aero experience. And what makes a good Aero experience isn't the color or necessarily the graphics, but the interaction and the way it connects with the customer. So I think our concept of what is common is changing a little bit. With respect to skinning, yes, much of the shell is done with Avalon and XAML, and much of the new theming infrastructure. How much that's open and how much that's not, I don't think we have a firm answer on that. I think it'll probably be more than less, but we'll have to see on that.
I recommend that you do. I think it would be a terrific thing. So.
That's fair feedback, and I think we all realized that if we locked it down in some way, that would last maybe about 30 seconds before it got unlocked. So, because you guys are pretty inventive. So, yes.
Hi. Does it make sense to generate XAML from a server and to push it to Longhorn? If I make a comparison with HTML pushed from a server to the browser, is it a scenario that makes sense, or
yes.
does XAML needs to be compiled on the?
No, XAML does not necessarily need to be compiled on the server. One of the scenarios we're working through is server-generated content when it has procedural code on the back end. We know absolutely that if you have server-generated code that's purely declarative, that makes a ton of sense. We can just send that down to the client. The question is, when you have procedural code, how does that come down? What's the right way to do it? But the server scenario and the browser integration is a key scenario that we believe in going forward.
Thanks.
I'm going to take one more there.
Yeah. Are there going to be machines of any significance which are not going to have enough graphics capability to be able to run Longhorn? And what do you do? Do you just not load in those environments, or what?
Well, I think that we think about the user experience in three ways. There's the lowest possible end user experience that we can consider the legacy experience, where someone has upgraded a machine, it's low powered even by today's standards, and they might get a visual experience that's a lot like Windows XP, but it may have a different color. Then there's the super high-end glass experience. We think that that will push the bounds, and that there will not be 100% of machines shipping when we ship Longhorn that have the capability to display that. We think, though, that there's an experience in the middle where the applications are accelerated. Maybe the DCE doesn't run the desktop composition engine with glass. You don't get that shell, glass, swoopy experience, but you still would get acceleration within your application. So we're thinking about those three tiers. Where we draw the line exactly, I think it depends. Certainly, it is a non-goal to make sure that every single machine shipping when Longhorn shipping can do the latest and greatest whizzy thing. We want to push because we've heard feedback from our OEM partners that they want there to be a visual distinction. They want there to be an upsell. So I think that there will be some distinction there.
So to just sort of sum up that, what you mean is that features will sort of drop off as the hardware fails to support them, rather than just sort of display badly.
Well, two things on that. One is that the way that, for example, animations are specified is by timing, not by frames. So what that lets us do is on a higher end machine run it at a higher frame rate. What we will tend to do is to find an appropriate frame rate to display in a glitch-free manner. We would like to do that hardware accelerated. If we can't, we'll do that software. But the APIs aren't going to randomly change as the capabilities of the machine change. Or if you can imagine, let's say, a mobile experience where I have a laptop which is capable when it's plugged in to have the full-on experience, but maybe when I have it in a power-conserving mode, it wants to step down and not desktop composite and run at a lower frame rate. The APIs will be the same. The visual experience may step down, but we want the visual experience to be smooth no matter what the capabilities of the system are. Like glitching is the thing that we never want to see. So we'll do whatever we can do to not glitch, because that's the thing that's jarring, not necessarily a lower frame rate.
I have a question down here.
Is there somebody there I can't see? Blinded by the light? Yes, sir. That microphone there on? Help, help, baby people. Help that man.
Hello, can you? All right, great. Will there be any tools that will help us convert WinForm type applications today into XAML?
The question was, for those of you who couldn't hear, are there going to be tools to convert from Windows Forms to XAML? You know, I'm not sure yet. And, you know, fundamentally the issue there is that a button is a button. And that yes, in Avalon you can do more with that button. But we're not sure if people will want to, because there's good interop, to translate their whole form over and then work with it. So it's something we're looking at, we're considering it. I don't think we have a firm answer on it. And we're focusing more on interop right now than on migration. And that's why we kind of talked about interop and not migration, I guess. So the answer is don't know, depends on demand. There.
I noticed in the XAML examples that we've seen so far that just simple user interface stuff like size, font, color, all have their own attributes. And it seems to be that, like, to describe a relatively complex document, you're going to end up with a truckload of attributes. Is there a facility to, for example, have a CSS attribute associated with an element, so you can have it all in a single attribute?
So some of the attributes can be compound attributes, so that you can specify multiple things at once. They can also be put up into a style block, which is dissociated with the object, much like CSS, so that you don't have to have it directly on the object itself. So I think we have a superset of the functionality in CSS for that, so you should be able to do both things. And I think we'll show that in some of the detailed presentations coming up.
Will you support CSS syntax directly?
CSS syntax directly. Under consideration, not sure.
Okay, thanks.
On the end there.
Yes, and developing enterprise-wide applications for better preparation for Avalon, are you suggesting that we start targeting Windows Forms development versus ASP.NET?
Well, I think that the fundamental approach we've taken with Avalon is to go more client-centric. ASP.NET is certainly HTML projection. It's an important part for enterprise applications. What I would think about is what parts of your enterprise applications would be better served by smarter clients. Think about writing those with Windows Forms, and that will get you ready for converting over to Avalon. So I think it's a mix of both. I don't think we're saying HTML goes away. What we're saying is the parts of HTML infrastructures which are today rich, backed by ActiveX controls, backed by Windows Forms, backed by VB controls existing, maybe those switch over. But I think there's still going to be a mix of HTML and Avalon, into the foreseeable future. Okay. In the center.
Yeah, besides Avalon, does the Avalon renderer understood XSLFO and Smile? Or if not, are you going to consider that in the future?
One of the things about the platform is we think about this separation between the core services, and the framework. The current framework that we've done represents the classes that you see, the buttons, the images, etc. We think that it would be possible, and we're doing some prototyping in the space, to build additional frameworks on top of it. But we want to make sure that the one that we have primarily here has as much functionality as people will need. We expect that people might decide to build other frameworks, and we might even decide to build other frameworks in the future on top of it. Yes, sir.
Are you going to have any kind of standardized format for vector-based icons? And if so, what about scaling those images to appear better at smaller and larger resolutions?
Is your question for icons that appear in the shell?
Or in applications?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Let me come up afterwards and we'll find the right person to answer that for you. Right there. Help.
There we go. Does future proofing include non-square pixels and greater than 8 bits a channel?
No. You can do it if you want to, but it's the chainsaw. You decide how many limbs to cut off. Yes?
Yeah, this is related to the other question regarding Windows Forms versus ASP. So what would the recommendation be if we're developing web applications using web forms to ease the migration to Longhorn?
Well,
or is there no true migration?
It's an interesting question, and I think that the challenge there is, people migrated from smart client applications that were really hard to deploy to web-based applications which weren't, and we lost some functionality along the way. And what I think we've been hearing is there's some places where that's okay, and there's other places where that really hurts a lot in terms of user productivity and in terms of the applications that people want to have. So what I would look at is, where are the places where there's pain because we have only the HTML platform that we can target, and where are the places where the HTML platform is doing okay? And where there's places to pain, I always think about making those smarter and migrating that. We're still going to support HTML and have a world-class browser in Longhorn. HTML is a reality in corporate applications. But think about how to replace parts of your app where maybe it struggles, it creaks a little bit with smarter client technology, starting with Windows Forms and migrating to Avalon going forward.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Similar question, but with respect to Win32 migration. Suppose you had a friend who worked for a third-party ISV whose customer base was going to be primarily on pre-Longhorn OS even until well past Longhorn ships. What's your best recommendation on migration?
Well, I think that the fundamental investment that Microsoft is making for developers going forward is the managed code platform. So I'd start with managed code. And obviously, if you're talking about multi-operating system, I do Windows Forms there. So managed code first, Windows Forms, and then hopefully optimized for Longhorn with Avalon when that time comes. Question in the center. Or can you not? No volume?
I'll just talk loud.
No, that worked. It's magic.
Is there any Win32 API work that we will still have to do when we're doing Avalon work?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Will be there any point where we have to drop down to the Win32 API once Avalon and Longhorn is released, or is everything managed code?
Have to or want to are two separate issues. have to, we hope not. You may choose to use unmanaged APIs to access some of the very lowest level bits. And one of the ways to think about that is, if you were pacing like your text APIs as opposed to using xtext out, you could use some of the other text APIs that do subpixel clear type. That we may have unmanaged access to that. We hope that you can do it all managed all the time. Go manage code. But we think that we'll have some unmanaged access as well.
Okay, one last thing. For the PDC bits, what is really the minimum requirements?
For the PDC bits, what is the minimum? They're listed on the disk. They don't let me answer questions like that. Come on.
You talked about the concept of building custom components by using inheritance or composition. Do you have some similar concept to the attached behaviors in DHTML whereby you can create components that are self-contained and add some behavior to an existing display element and can be added and removed dynamically?
Much of the functionality that you could do with behaviors you can now do through composition and through styling, because there's going to be some really cool stuff we can do with styling around animation and storyboarding where you can get a lot of that kind of baked on the side. I think you'll find that styles are far more functional than any sort of CSS styling we had before because of the compositional nature of all the objects, like the background brush. Being able to put multiple objects inside of a background brush is amazingly powerful when it comes to controlling controls. It's kind of redundant. So attached behaviors, not so much, because we had real issues with kind of method exposure on that. But doing it through styles, we think that a lot of that functionality is exposed that way. And the guys who designed behaviors are working on this too, so we're trying to make sure we got the right bits and pieces there. Okay, I'll take one more question across the landscape, and that gentleman I think has been waiting longest.
Will Avalon support rendering of 3D content in any way?
Yes.
Okay. Does that mean stuff like perspective? That's
Yes.
a good answer. Okay.
You're the next contestant on Ask Me Questions.
Do you intend to do any facility to separate strings or text from XAML? Because you separated code from design, now you have to separate language from the design. So
yes, tools to do localization and globalization, an important part of the platform.
But it also need to be in the syntax because it's too easy to put string in, and so you need some way to reference an external string in a nice way, and not just a tool to regenerate the XAML. Because I don't want to have tons of versions of XAML files, each one for each language.
We totally agree, and we don't want to have tons either because that would make Windows bigger and ugly. So we're working on it because we are using XAML internally. So this is, and we have MUI, good name, and we want to have single binaries and make sure the resources are separated. So it's a critical problem for us to solve as well. When I was talking before about us having features that developers can stand on our shoulders, not on our toes, this is a big one in that space as well. Accessibility, globalization, localization, all critical features for the platform. And I think that in the hands-on lab or in the client track, you can talk to the guys designing that, and we'd love your feedback on what sorts of services you need to make sure that you can build your apps the right way.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I'll take one more question. Who would like to ask me? Yes, sir.
The 3D question, expanding on the prior one. What's the migration strategy for CAD and game developers that are using OpenGL and DirectX 3D?
Boy, I'm not, what's that? So if you go over to the client lounge, we'll find somebody from the DirectX team to answer that question for you because I'm not the best person to do that.
Thanks.
Thank you very, very much for your time.